September 3rd, 1943, somewhere in rural Kansas. The truck rattled down a dirt road, kicking up dust that turned the afternoon sun into a hazy golden blur. In the back, 12 German prisoners sat in silence, their hands gripping the wooden benches as the vehicle bounced over ruts and potholes. They had been told they were being transported to a labor camp. They imagined barbed wire, guard towers, work details that would break their backs and spirits in equal measure. But when the truck finally stopped and the canvas flap was pulled back, what they saw made no sense. There was no camp, no wire, no towers, just fields, endless fields stretching to the horizon, painted in shades of gold and green, corn as tall as a man, wheat swaying in the breeze like an ocean-frozen mid-wave, barns the size of cathedrals, silos that pierce the sky like monuments to abundance. One prisoner, a man named Ernst Hoffmann, 32 years old, a farmer's son from a village outside Dresden, stepped down from the truck and stood there, frozen, staring at the landscape before him. His mouth was open, his eyes were wide. He looked like a man who had just seen God and discovered God was nothing like the paintings. "This is a trick," he whispered in German. "This can't be real." But it was real. And over the next 18 months, Ernst and thousands of prisoners like him would come to understand something that shattered every belief they had been taught about their enemy. That America wasn't just wealthy. It was impossibly, incomprehensibly, almost offensively abundant. And that abundance would break them in ways the war never could. If stories like this matter to you, listen closely, because what happened when German prisoners saw American farms wasn't just culture shock. It was a revelation. A moment when the propaganda collapsed under the weight of reality. A moment when soldiers who had been told they were fighting for survival realized they had been lied to about what survival even meant. This is the story of men who crossed an ocean believing they were superior, only to discover they had been fighting for a country that couldn't even feed its own people, while their enemy wasted more food in a day than they had seen in a year. History doesn't lie, but governments do. And sometimes the truth is as simple as standing in a field and realizing that everything you were told about weakness and strength was backwards. The air smelled like earth and manure, and something else Ernst couldn't quite place, something sweet and chemical and foreign. Later, he would learn it was the smell of fertilizer, of pesticides, of industrial agriculture on a scale he had never imagined possible. The farmer who owned the land was a man named William Henderson, a third-generation Kansan with sunburned skin and hands like leather. He stood in front of the prisoners, arms crossed, studying them the way a man studies livestock at auction. Not with cruelty, just with assessment. These were his workers now. He needed to know what they were worth. "Any of you know how to farm?" he asked in slow, careful English. Ernst raised his hand. So did 3 others. Henderson nodded. "Good. You'll work the combines. The rest of you will learn." He pointed toward the barn. "Bunks are in the loft. Meals are at 6, noon, and 6. You work dawn to dusk. You don't run, you don't steal, you don't cause trouble, and we'll get along fine. Understood?" The prisoners nodded, even though half of them didn't understand the words. They understood the tone, and the tone was strange. Not hostile, not cruel, just matter-of-fact, businesslike, as if this was normal, as if employing enemy soldiers to harvest wheat was just another Tuesday in Kansas. Ernst walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on gravel. Around him the other prisoners muttered in German, their voices low and confused. "Where are the guards?" one asked. "There," another said, pointing to a single American soldier leaning against a fence post, smoking a cigarette. He looked bored. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Just one," the first prisoner said. "There are 12 of us." "Where would we run?" Ernst said quietly. "Look around. There's nothing but fields for 100 kilometers. We'd starve before we found a road." It was true. The farm was an island in an ocean of agriculture. Even if they escaped, where would they go? How would they survive? They didn't speak the language. They didn't know the land. They had no money, no food, no plan. Running wasn't an option, not because they were guarded, but because there was nowhere to run to. That realization settled over them like a weight. They weren't prisoners because of walls or wire. They were prisoners because of geography, because of logistics, because America was so vast, so empty, so overwhelmingly huge that escape was mathematically impossible. Ernst climbed the ladder into the barn loft. The space was clean, dry. There were 12 cots lined up in neat rows, each with a blanket and a pillow, a far cry from the barracks in North Africa, where they had slept on dirt floors and fought rats for scraps of bread. He sat on the edge of a cot and stared out the window at the fields. The sun was setting, painting the wheat in shades of amber and fire. It was beautiful, painfully beautiful. The kind of beauty that makes you realize how ugly the world you left behind had become. "This isn't real," a prisoner named Otto said, sitting on the cot next to him. "This is propaganda. They're showing us the best farms, the richest land, to make us think America is stronger than it is." Ernst didn't answer, because part of him wanted to believe that. Part of him needed to believe that, because if this was real, if this was normal, then what did that say about Germany? What did that say about the war? They expected poverty. They expected desperation. They expected a country on the brink of collapse, struggling to feed its people, rationing every scrap of food like Germany had been doing since 1939. Instead, they found a country that threw away more food than most Germans had seen in years. The next morning, Ernst woke before dawn. He climbed down from the loft and walked to the farmhouse, where Henderson's wife, a woman named Ruth with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, was preparing breakfast for the workers. Ernst stood in the doorway watching her crack eggs into a skillet. Real eggs. A dozen of them, maybe more. She didn't even count them. She just cracked them, one after another, like they were infinite. In Germany, eggs were rationed. One per person per week, if you were lucky. Ernst's family hadn't seen a real egg in 6 months before he was conscripted. They ate powdered eggs, ersatz eggs, eggs made from God knows what chemicals and sawdust and hope. But here, Ruth cracked a dozen eggs like it was nothing, and when she saw Ernst staring, she smiled and said, "You hungry?" Ernst nodded, unable to speak. She scooped eggs onto a plate, added bacon, real bacon, thick and crispy, and handed it to him. "Eat up. You'll need your strength." Ernst sat at the table and stared at the plate. His hands were shaking. Not from hunger, from disbelief. The other prisoners filtered in, one by one, and each of them had the same reaction. Silence. Staring. The slow, dawning realization that they were eating better as prisoners in America than they had as soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Otto sat down across from Ernst, his eyes fixed on the bacon. "This is a trick," he said again, quieter this time. "They're trying to break us." "Maybe," Ernst said. "Or maybe they just have more food than they know what to do with." By 1943, the United States was producing more food than any nation in human history. The mechanization of agriculture, tractors, combines, harvesters, had transformed farming from a labor-intensive struggle into an industrial juggernaut. A single American farm could produce more wheat in a year than an entire German village could grow in a decade. And it wasn't just wheat. It was everything. Corn, soybeans, beef, pork, dairy. America was drowning in food. So much food that the government paid farmers to destroy crops, to plow fields under, to slaughter livestock and bury it, just to keep prices stable. Meanwhile, in Germany, people were starving. Rations were cut month after month. Bread was mixed with sawdust to stretch supplies. Meat was a distant memory. Children grew up malnourished, their bones brittle, their growth stunted. The prisoners had been told that America was weak, that it was a nation of fat, lazy degenerates who didn't know how to work, who didn't know how to fight, who would collapse the moment the war turned serious. But standing in that Kansas farmhouse, eating bacon and eggs like it was nothing, Ernst realized the propaganda had been backwards. America wasn't weak, it was terrifyingly strong, and the strength wasn't in its military. It was in its land, in its machinery, in its ability to produce so much abundance that it could afford to feed its enemies better than its enemies had ever fed themselves. The war, Ernst realized, had been lost before it even began, not on the battlefield, but in the fields. Because you can't fight a country that has more food than it knows what to do with. You can't outlast a nation that treats surplus like a problem to be solved, not a miracle to be celebrated. Germany had been fighting for survival. America had been fighting for sport. Ernst spent the first week in a daze. Every day brought a new shock, a new impossibility, a new crack in the foundation of everything he thought he knew. The farm had running water. Not a pump. Not a well, but water that came from pipes, hot and cold, controlled by a simple twist of a handle. Ernst had grown up washing in a basin filled from a well in the village square. Here, the Hendersons had a bathroom inside the house, a toilet that flushed, a bathtub, as if water was so abundant it could be used for comfort, not just survival. The farm had electricity. Every building, the house, the barn, the silos, was wired. At night, lights flickered on with the flip of a switch, turning darkness into day. In Ernst's village, candles and oil lamps were the norm. Electricity was for cities, for the wealthy, for people who didn't live in the real world. But here, electricity was everywhere. The Hendersons had a radio in the kitchen that played music all day. They had a refrigerator, a machine that kept food cold, that preserved milk and meat for weeks. Ernst had heard of such things, but he had never seen one. In Germany, food was eaten immediately, or it spoiled. There was no surplus, no tomorrow. And then there were the machines, the tractors that could plow a field in hours, work that would take a team of horses days to complete, the combines that harvested wheat faster than 20 men with scythes, the trucks that hauled tons of grain without breaking a sweat. Ernst had been a farmer. He knew how hard the work was. He knew the ache in your back after a day in the fields, the blisters on your hands, the exhaustion that made you collapse into bed and sleep like the dead. But here, the machines did most of the work. The prisoners were just there to guide them, to adjust them, to keep them running. It was still hard work, but it was nothing like the back-breaking labor Ernst had grown up with. One afternoon, as Ernst guided a combine through a wheat field, Henderson climbed up into the cab beside him. He watched Ernst work for a while, then said, "You're good at this. You grow up farming?" Ernst nodded. "My father had a farm, small, maybe 10 hectares. We grew wheat, potatoes, some vegetables. We had 3 cows." Henderson nodded. "How much wheat did you harvest in a year?" Ernst thought for a moment. "Maybe 2 tons, in a good year." Henderson laughed, not cruelly but with genuine amusement. "This field will yield 50 tons, and I've got 6 more fields this size." Ernst's hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. Because the math was impossible. Henderson's farm produced more wheat in a single harvest than Ernst's village had produced in a decade. How? Ernst asked finally, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the combine. Henderson shrugged. "Machines, fertilizer, crop rotation, irrigation. We've been doing this for 100 years, figured out what works." Ernst wanted to argue. He wanted to say that it wasn't fair, that Germany didn't have the land, didn't have the resources, didn't have the history. But he couldn't. Because the truth was simpler and more brutal than that. Germany had spent the last decade preparing for war. America had spent the last century preparing for peace. And when war came, it turned out that peace was better preparation. That night, in the barn loft, Otto confronted Ernst. "You're starting to believe them," Otto said, his voice sharp with accusation. "You're starting to think we were wrong." "We were wrong," Ernst said quietly. Otto stepped closer, his fists clenched. "We were fighting for survival, for our families, for our country." "No," Ernst said, standing up to face him. "We were fighting for a lie. We were told America was weak, that they were our enemies, that we had to destroy them or they would destroy us. But look around, Otto. Does this look like weakness? Does this look like a country that needed to be destroyed?" "They have resources we don't have," Otto said. "That doesn't make them right." "Maybe not," Ernst said. "But it makes us wrong, because we started a war we couldn't win. We attacked people who were never our enemies. And for what? So Hitler could build an empire? So we could starve while he lived in a palace?" Otto turned away, his shoulders shaking. "I can't believe that," he whispered. "If I believed that, then everything I did, everything I saw, everyone I killed, it was all for nothing." Ernst put a hand on Otto's shoulder. "I know, but believing a lie doesn't make it true. And ignoring the truth doesn't make it go away." The shock wasn't limited to Ernst's farm. Across the United States, in over 500 POW camps spread across 46 states, German prisoners were experiencing the same revelation. They were being confronted with an America that bore no resemblance to the one they had been taught to hate. In Texas, prisoners worked cattle ranches that stretched for thousands of acres, land so vast it made the entire German countryside look like a garden plot. In California, they picked fruit in orchards that produced more oranges in a season than all of Germany had imported in a year. In Wisconsin, they worked dairy farms with herds of hundreds of cows, each producing more milk than seemed physically possible. Everywhere they went, the prisoners saw abundance, not luxury, not decadence, just enough. More than enough. An America where waste was normal, where throwing away food was common, where broken machinery was replaced instead of repaired because new was cheaper than old. It was incomprehensible, and it was devastating, because for years the prisoners had been told a story about Germany's greatness, about its superiority, about its destiny to rule Europe and reshape the world. They had been told that Germans were stronger, smarter, more disciplined than their enemies, that the Allies were weak, decadent, corrupted by democracy and diversity, and all the things that made nations soft. But now, standing in the middle of Kansas, eating bacon and eggs and watching machines do in hours what would take days of human labor, Ernst realized the story had been a lie. All of it. Every word. Germany wasn't superior. It was desperate. It had spent the last century fighting wars, losing wars, rebuilding from wars. It had burned through its resources, its people, its future, all in pursuit of glory that never came. And when Hitler promised to make Germany great again, what he really meant was, "I will take what others have built and call it ours." But America hadn't built its greatness through conquest. It had built it through time, through generations of people who planted crops and raised children, and built machines, and didn't spend every decade tearing themselves apart in wars of national pride. The prisoners began to talk among themselves, quietly at first, then more openly. They compared notes. They shared stories. They described the farms they worked, the towns they saw, the people they met. And slowly, a consensus emerged. They had been lied to. About everything. One evening, a prisoner named Hans, a schoolteacher from Hamburg who had been conscripted in 1941, stood up in the barn and said what everyone was thinking. "We didn't lose the war because we weren't strong enough. We lost because we were never supposed to win. Because you can't beat a country like this. You can't outproduce them. You can't outbuild them. You can't starve them. The only way to beat America is to make them not care. And we made them care." The room was silent, because Hans was right, and everyone knew it. Germany had poked the sleeping giant, and the giant hadn't just woken up. It had stood up and revealed that it was 10 times bigger than anyone had imagined. Ernst thought about his father, back in Germany, probably starving, probably cold, probably wondering if his son was still alive. He thought about his village, the small farms, the hard work, the constant struggle just to survive, and he realized his father had been a slave, not to a person, but to the land, to the weather, to the limits of what one man could do with his hands and a plow. But here, the land served the people. The machines served the people. And the result was a country where even prisoners ate better than free men in Germany. It was a revelation that changed everything, because once you see that, you can't unsee it. Once you understand that the war wasn't about ideology or survival or destiny, that it was just about one group of men lying to another group of men so they could take what didn't belong to them, you can't go back to believing in the lie. They called it labor. But it was the freest Ernst had ever felt. In the Wehrmacht, every moment had been controlled. When you woke, when you ate, when you marched, when you fought, when you slept, you were a cog in a machine, a number in a system, a body to be used and discarded when it broke. But here, on Henderson's farm, Ernst had agency. Small amounts, yes, but it was there. He could choose which row to harvest first. He could take breaks when he needed them. He could talk to the other prisoners without fear of punishment. He could think his own thoughts without worrying that someone was listening. It was strange, paradoxical. He was a prisoner, but he felt more human than he had in years. One Saturday, Henderson gave the prisoners the day off. "It's the Sabbath," he said. "Even prisoners deserve rest." The prisoners didn't know what to do with themselves. They had been working non-stop for weeks. Rest felt foreign, suspicious, like a trap. But Ernst decided to explore. He walked down the dirt road toward the nearest town, a tiny place called Edgerton, population maybe 300. He expected to be stopped, to be questioned, to be sent back, but no one stopped him. A few people stared. He was still wearing his Wehrmacht uniform, faded and patched, but unmistakable. But most just nodded or waved or ignored him entirely. He reached the town square. There was a general store, a church, a post office, a diner. Normal, mundane. The kind of place that existed in every country, in every time, unchanged by war or politics or ideology. Ernst stood there, in the middle of the square, and realized this was what Germany had been trying to destroy. Not armies, not governments, but this, small towns, normal lives, people who just wanted to plant crops and raise children and live in peace. And for what? So Hitler could draw new lines on a map? So Ernst and millions like him could die in foreign lands for a cause that made less sense the more you thought about it? He sat on a bench outside the general store. A woman came out, elderly, with white hair and a kind face. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "You one of the POWs working the Henderson farm?" Ernst nodded, wary. She smiled. "Thought so. You boys need anything, you let me know. War's hard enough without being far from home." She walked away before Ernst could respond. He sat there for another hour, watching people go about their lives. Farmers buying supplies, children playing in the street, a couple walking hand in hand, laughing about something Ernst couldn't hear. This was the enemy. This was what he had been taught to hate, to fear, to destroy. And it looked exactly like home. That night, back at the farm, Otto asked him, "Where did you go?" "To town," Ernst said. "Were you planning to escape?" Ernst laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Escape to where? This is the freest I've been in 5 years." Otto stared at him. "You've gone soft. They've broken you." "No," Ernst said. "They've shown me what we were fighting for. And it wasn't this. It was never this." The irony was almost too much to bear. The prisoners worked the farms that fed the soldiers who fought against their homeland. They harvested wheat that would be baked into bread and shipped across the Atlantic to feed American troops liberating Europe. They were literally sustaining the war effort that was destroying their country. And yet, most of them didn't sabotage anything, didn't slow down, didn't resist. Because they had come to understand something fundamental. The war wasn't their war. It had never been. It was Hitler's war. And if their labor helped end it faster, maybe that was a good thing. Maybe the real enemy wasn't America. Maybe it was the lie that had sent them here in the first place. Ernst stayed on Henderson's farm until the war ended in May 1945. When the news came, when they heard that Germany had surrendered, that Hitler was dead, that the Reich had fallen, the prisoners gathered in the barn loft and sat in silence. Some cried, some stared at nothing. Some laughed, but the laughter sounded like breaking glass. Ernst felt nothing. No relief, no joy, no sorrow, just emptiness. Because the war ending didn't change anything. Germany was destroyed. His village was probably rubble. His father was probably dead. And even if Ernst went home, what would he be going home to? Henderson came to the barn that evening. He climbed the ladder and stood among the prisoners, hat in his hands. "I know today's hard," he said. "I know you're thinking about home, about family. But I want you to know, you boys did good work here, honest work. And if any of you want to stay, if you want to make a life here after you're released, I'll vouch for you. I'll help you get papers, find jobs, get settled." Ernst looked up at him. "Why?" Henderson shrugged. "Because you're good people. You made mistakes. Hell, we all make mistakes. But you learned. You grew. And that's more than a lot of folks can say." 3 months later, Ernst was released. He was given a choice: return to Germany or stay in America. He chose to stay. He wrote to his father hoping the letter would reach him. It took 6 months, but eventually a reply came. His father was alive. The village had been bombed, but it was being rebuilt. His father understood why Ernst wasn't coming home. He even approved. "You found a better life," his father wrote. "Don't waste it." Ernst worked on Henderson's farm for another 2 years, saving money, learning English, becoming part of the community. In 1947, he bought a small plot of land 20 miles away and started his own farm. He married a local woman named Sarah, the daughter of a shopkeeper in Edgerton. They had 4 children. Ernst never forgot what he had learned in those 18 months as a prisoner. He never forgot the shock of seeing American abundance, the slow unraveling of the lies he had been taught, the realization that the enemy had never been the enemy at all. He told his children about the war, not the battles, not the glory, but the lies, the propaganda, the way governments convince young men to kill each other for causes that don't matter and borders that don't mean anything. "The war taught me one thing," he told them. "Never trust anyone who tells you that someone else is your enemy just because they were born on the other side of a line on a map." Ernst Hoffmann died in 1989 at the age of 78. He was buried in the Edgerton Cemetery, next to Sarah, under a headstone that read, "Farmer, father, friend, a man who crossed an ocean and found home." He left Germany as a soldier and returned as a man who understood that the real war was never between nations. It was between truth and lies. And the moment you see the truth, you can't fight for the lies anymore. There is a lesson here, a lesson that every generation forgets and has to learn again at great cost. War is a story that governments tell their people to justify violence, to rally support, to turn neighbors into enemies and strangers into monsters. And the story is always the same. They are a threat. They are different. They are coming for you. And the only way to survive is to destroy them first. But the German POWs who worked American farms learned something different. They learned that the story was a lie. That the enemy wasn't a threat. They were just people. People with farms and families and lives that looked exactly like their own. People who wanted the same things they wanted: safety, comfort, peace. And once you see that, once you understand that the enemy is just a human being who was told the same lies you were told, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to hating them. You can't go back to believing that the war was necessary or just or worth the cost. The shock of American abundance broke the German prisoners in a way that torture never could, because torture confirms the story. Torture proves that the enemy is cruel, that they deserve to be hated, that you were right to fight them, but kindness, especially unearned kindness, especially abundance given freely to people who don't deserve it, kindness destroys the story. It reveals the lie. It forces you to confront the possibility that everything you believed was backwards. And that's the most dangerous thing you can do to a soldier. Show them the truth. The American government understood this. The policy of treating POWs well wasn't just about morality or following the Geneva Convention. It was strategic. Because prisoners who return home with stories of abundance, of kindness, of a world that doesn't match the propaganda, those prisoners become the most powerful weapon against future wars. They become living proof that the enemy isn't the enemy, that the story is a lie, that war is a choice, not a necessity. And in the case of Germany, it worked. The prisoners who returned home after the war carried with them memories of American farms, of machines and abundance, and people who treated them like human beings, even when they didn't have to. And when Germany was rebuilt, when democracy was restored, those memories mattered, because they reminded people that there was another way, that peace was possible, that the world didn't have to be a zero-sum game where one nation's gain was another's loss. History doesn't repeat itself. It waits for those who forget to listen. And right now, in a world where nationalism is rising, where borders are closing, where the old stories about enemies and threats and us versus them are being told again, the lesson of the German POWs is more important than ever. Because the story is still a lie. The enemy is still just people. And the moment we forget that, the moment we believe that our survival depends on their destruction, we become the very thing we claim to be fighting against. Ernst understood this. Henderson understood this. And the thousands of prisoners and guards who lived and worked together on American farms understood this. They learned it the hard way, through years of war and loss and suffering. But they learned it, and because they learned it, the world became a little bit better. Not perfect, not healed, but better. And maybe that's the only thing we can ever hope for, that in the middle of the lies, someone shows you the truth. That in the middle of the hatred, someone treats you with kindness. That in the middle of the war, someone reminds you that you are human. And so is the enemy. The guard never sleeps, and neither should we. There are more stories like this one. Stories buried in archives, forgotten in history books, waiting to be told. If this matters to you, if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, the archive opens every week. Stay with us. Which story should we open next? There are thousands, some darker, some stranger, some that will make you question everything you thought you knew about war. Tell us below. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who still believes the enemy is always the enemy, share this with them. Because the most dangerous weapon in war isn't a gun. It's a lie.